You're listening to Design Systems Beyond the Button, where we dive into everything related to design systems for everyone from newbies to seasoned practitioners. I'm Neff, Product Marketing Manager at zeroheight, and I'm excited to use this podcast to get my burning design systems questions answered. I'm joined by my colleague Michelle Chen, a design advocate who has seen and experienced so much around design systems.
And I'm looking forward to sharing the tips, tricks, and experiences based on what I've done, but also from what I've seen from other design system teams. There's not much being publicly said because design systems can be so personal to a company. So, this might be a great way to shed insight so you can create your bestest design system ever.
All right, we are calling this episode How Do You Even Start Documenting Patterns? And I think implicit in that episode title is the idea that a lot of people don't start with patterns. It's something that often comes with a little bit of design system maturity. I wanted to make sure that I sort of wrapped my head around exactly what we're talking about. So I went to a trusty source, Atlassian's design system, where they defined patterns, and they are calling patterns reusable combinations of components. One of the things that I thought was really, really cool about the way that they define them is that they are solutions that should help users solve a problem. And for designers, they're an easy to use template that helps us understand where to put components and how different problems might be looked at. Do you think that's a fair definition? How would you define patterns, Michelle?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting. I now now that I think about it, I've never been to Atlassian. Like I've been to their site, but I've never like read how they define patterns. But I think I really like the idea that there's solutions that help users solve a problem. I think to add to that, like the idea of problem solving and making it repeatable. So users can build that mental model of I know how to navigate to do complete this task within
Mm,
Confluence or Jira, whatever Atlassian product they're using is really great. That's like the magic of patterns is that reusability. And I think, for me, there's like two kinds of patterns. There are like screen patterns, so like the layout on the screen and what components are on a screen. But there's also like workflow patterns, so like the steps you would go to log into a product. So you
mhm,
see like the username and password screen. There is a link to forgot your password, and what that flow is like. So maybe then the next screen is like two-factor authentication, and the next screen is like where you are. So having consistency in like a workflow is also a good pattern. Um, and they both use like components from your design system. Um,
sure. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because something that you just said resonated with me quite a bit. Going back, of course, the title of the episode is "How do you start documenting patterns?" And when we think specifically about workflows, and I think sign in is a perfect example. Even if I, working at my company, have not yet documented the pattern associated with signing into the product, there are patterns that exist in the world, right? Like when you sign into any product, the pattern is basically the same. We've come to expect it as consumers. So, is it sort of fair to say that even if I haven't documented patterns, that there are some patterns that just exist in the ether that I should follow or at least draw some inspiration from?
Yeah, yeah, totally. I think that's the thing is like, part of doing good design is making things easy for the user. And these patterns, regardless of tool or company or product, very much follow the same flow, the same steps. So
Mm,
people know that as their mental model. And if you shake that up and because you want to be different or something like that, that can be really frustrating. I think, the idea of like, oh, let's get creative because we are, a different type of product. If it's adding friction, then that's going to really upset some users because they're so used to, you know, like user ID, then password, not the other way around. They know that they might have to jump to, a 2FA thing, or they
mm,
know that they have an option to, like, where do they click the link to reset their password. So those things are very, so you're kind of just designing within those kind of understood patterns, like universally understood patterns. And maybe you don't have to document that specifically, but maybe you do depending on your use case. So Um, I think there's a lot that you can document in terms of patterns, and maybe you stick to some that are more unique to your product's needs, rather than over rotating on a login flow pattern.
Fair enough. No need to redefine that one, right? Like it's been defined for us. Let's go with it. Let's spend some mental energy working on something else. So, I guess when you do define the patterns that are specific to your product and specific to your context, like how do you go about documenting them? Like if we think about documenting a pattern, what are the things that have to be there in order for designers and developers to be able to follow it?
Yeah, I think, like, even backing up from, like, documenting a specific pattern, it's really important that your organization define what a pattern is. Because I
Hmm.
think people, especially if they, have worked at different companies, switch teams, they might have a different understanding of what a pattern is. So having that clear understanding of like this is what our design system considers a pattern, is really helpful because it sets that tone, sets the expectations of what you should expect in those patterns. So I would definitely recommend that first, and that gets everyone on the same page because it can get, because of the fluidity of patterns. So patterns aren't necessarily that prescriptive. Like some aspects can be prescriptive, but some aspects are fluid because they're patterns and not specific components. So that can help guide that conversation. Um,
Mm. Tell me a little bit about that in terms of patterns not being prescriptive, because the way that I'm thinking about it, and like major caveat, I am not a designer. That's why I'm here as the friend who's asking the questions. But I would think that like if I go to a design system site and I see a pattern documented, my mind would say, okay, that component is supposed to go exactly where it is in that pattern, and I'm supposed to have exactly this amount of text and so on and so forth, which would lead me to believe that it is prescriptive. But you're saying that that's not the case. So how should I look at patterns, and how do I then take that pattern and implement it in my own design?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that's the thing is like you can have components like a button component. It's very simple. And that's pretty prescriptive. You don't have much ability to change too much with it. And then you could have more complex components, which are, so for example, maybe like a tooltip functionality or a little like dialog box that pops up. There might be, very prescriptive elements within that that you have to follow. But maybe, a login flow follows a pattern for web versus mobile that has a little bit more flexibility. Or like my favorite example is like an empty state. So when you go, sign into a brand new account and like you land on that first page and it's empty. So there's some flexibility there. You probably should have a heading and maybe that's
Mm,
prescribed, but like some additional like context, like a sentence or two, that might be optional, and maybe an illustration's optional, or it's like a strongly recommended thing to have.
hmm,
A call to action to, fill that space, might, is likely to be required. So, understanding kind of like what is optional, what isn't optional. That's kind of like where that flexibility comes
mhm,
into play with patterns. And the idea behind patterns is that you're following uh, like a set of guidelines and principles to maintain some level of consistency, but there is flexibility based on your situation. So that can afford designers a lot more options to meet the user's needs. So really kind of solving problems for the users. Like a good example of like a pattern is a dashboard. So maybe you have like some basic layout patterns for a dashboard. And if you have different types of users, um, say like an employee versus a manager versus like an executive, they might have different types of dashboards or different if they're in different business units like finance or HR or what have you. They might all have a dashboard that they land on, but it could look different. But how do you maintain similarity, but how do you serve the user's needs with that flexibility that you need of in terms of serving up content, the types of widgets on the dashboard, that type of thing.
Yeah, I think I had the aha moment as you were speaking when there was the difference between like a manager and an administrator. Because I guess if we call back to patterns as an opportunity to solve a user's needs, then we're like, oh, okay, they have different problems. Therefore, the pattern is going to lead them toward a slightly different solution. I do think though, and I think my question here is around consistency, right? And I think when we talk about design systems, that is something that consistently comes up. How do we make sure that products are consistent? So if patterns are meant to be flexible, what part of it ought to be rigid, right? Like, is it 70% of it that should look the same regardless of the user? Is it 90% of it? Is it something else? I know you're going to say it depends, probably, but I guess like how do I know that I haven't deviated too far from the pattern that we are no longer consistent in the product?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a really great question because I think that's the ongoing, like, maybe like conflict or internal conflict that people have with patterns of like how much, like, I really want to push the boundaries, but how much can I do that? So I think a lot of that is, you know, it definitely depends on the percentage, right? Like, there's not going to be like 100% or 90% or what have you. But I think the idea is like, you know, establishing like it should use these components,
Mm,
or it should use like, and I think you're like, now you're kind of like, when there isn't the need for specific components to be used, like you're thinking about more of the foundational stuff of like, how do we typically space elements on a page? How do we, what are the colors that we typically use? So the foundations of your design system, like what's the typography like? What scales are we using just to have that consistency? So you're relying a lot more on those foundations than maybe necessarily components.
yeah, totally. It kind of seems to me that patterns are like the big boss of design systems, and you have to like meet and defeat all these other little bosses first. Like you have to define what your topography looks like. You have to have some of those base level components. You have to figure out like what different states of different things might look like. So when are you ready to start documenting patterns? Is there something like tried and true in your experience where you say, okay, when you've done X, Y, and Z, and you can check that, then you're ready to start thinking about patterns? Or how does that generally work? Because it seems like you could start thinking about patterns too early and not have the necessary things prior to actually make those robust enough, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I think that's the thing is like, it's funny because I patterns were around before atomic design. So like,
What?
yeah, so atomic design invented, established, I don't know, born 2014, 2013. So I think the idea is that before that there was like Yahoo had this like UI pattern library, so they would kind of just say like this is how you should uh do this flow, or like represent the screen. Like these are like the general elements. So like a, like a address form. This is kind of the elements you would include. This is how you would create like a, I don't know, like a login flow. Like it had these like UI patterns. I'll have to like dig into the archives because I did find like a on the Wayback Machine, like what the UI pattern library, like Yahoo's UI pattern library was like. Um, so I think patterns have been around before components, but we focus so much on components. And I think to a certain extent, you do have to have those components ready, but you probably already have some patterns established, like a login pattern, for example.
Mm,
Um, in terms of like when you want to start documenting patterns or identifying patterns, I think it depends, sorry. But I think it depends on, like, your team's needs. Like, if you are trying to align, so I remember, this one company I worked at, like, way back in the day, like, our first initiative was just to align on, like, a login flow as our first pattern, and we weren't even sharing components yet because this was, like,
mm.
pre-Sketch, pre-Figma, and we were just like, "Let's just make sure the login looks consistent across so people can understand that we have an identity and that you can trust our products." Um, and that did take some time. I think what ends up happening is that it's very easy to define, well, not easy, but defining components, like it's very prescriptive, right? You're like, I'm going to use this font for this button. I'm going to use this size. It's going to have these colors. it's going to have these specific states. It's very, very prescriptive. And that is something that we can all like latch onto and gravitate to because we're like, we will be able to find an answer. But with
Mhm.
patterns, it's a lot harder because there are more options. So, like, I think people get a little like, I don't know, squeamish when they have to like sit down and define a pattern. Um, because you're like, okay, how do I afford flexibility for people? How do I know the prescriptive elements that I'm choosing are the right prescriptive elements? Like you can really second guess yourself when you're just establishing a pattern. So I think that just makes it really, it makes it more difficult to establish them. But I think, you know, I would start with figuring out like what's repeatable within your
Mm.
products and what seems to do really well, and is that something that other products can use? Or where is there a lot of inconsistency happening beyond components? Like even if you've created all these components, why why do the I don't know, the accordions or what have you function differently from different screens or different areas of the app, and how can we align that? So um, kind of picking and choosing that way on some like I guess like easy wins. They might not be easy to figure out, but like they could be easier to figure out. Like I would make I would find I would look for patterns that exist in your product already versus make something up for the sake of I saw this other design system have this pattern, so we should probably have that. Because that's like way more work. And it could be, I don't know, for nothing because you might never need that pattern. If that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, it does. So I guess what I'm hearing is like you probably have patterns that exist in your product right now, have like some data or understanding about what's working well and what's not, and like maybe start by documenting those. The other thing that I'm hearing, and I want to call back a little bit to a talk that you did at last year's Converge, which is Zero Heights Design System Conference, about patterns, right? And I'm probably going to butcher this talk, but that gives you an opportunity to come back and correct me and show everyone how smart you are. But I think the general idea is that there are lots of patterns that exist throughout a particular product. And if I remember correctly, IKEA is like a good example, right? They're like this big, like global company. And whether you're on the IKEA Swedish site or you're on the IKEA French site, you're probably there to buy furniture, right? So there's a pattern there. We want to be able to show people like what the furniture looks like, be able to tell them how much it costs, with obviously the action that like you should buy this furniture and go home and spend days assembling it. So that's what we want to do. But the way in which each of the consumers in each of these different countries interact with the product is going to be different. I think one of the examples that you talked about was like some people want more information before they click buy, some people want less information. There are languages that are right to left, there are languages that are left to right, like so on and so forth. And I think what you were proposing in that particular talk is that like some of the flexibility that we have might not necessarily be incumbent on the individual designer, but instead we might have different versions of patterns, right? So it's like if this is the checkout page, like this is the checkout page for the United States and Canada, and it should follow pattern A. And this is a checkout page for France, and it should follow pattern B, and so on and so forth. Am I getting that right? And if so, can you talk a little bit about like how we might have these like different versions of patterns?
Yeah, yeah, no, you did an excellent job. That was really great. I love, yeah, hearing your perspective on that. So I think that's the thing is like, um, you know, my whole talk, it was called Decolonizing Your Design System, and we can put a link in the show notes. The idea is that, like, in the Western world, we are so used to designing in this one way, but in different cultures, how they consume information, how they do certain things, um, it might not fit the box of how Western design patterns are established. So it's thinking about, who your users are and what works best for them to accomplish their tasks. So, for example, um, and I love IKEA's site. So, like after this uh, webinar, I definitely check out IKEA's site and poke around because, like, they have probably like I don't know 50 some odd countries represented and like 150 different languages. So, if you go to like IKEA the Egypt site, they have a version in Arabic and they have a version in English. And you'll see that so in Arabic you read right to left versus left to right, and everything is mirrored. So it's the same content, just mirrored. And that way it's like you're recognizing, people who read in Arabic shouldn't have to like, brute force, like have to be forced to read something in a way that isn't, or use the site in a way that isn't conducive to how their language is written. So, um, I think that's super important to understand the context of your users and know that there can be different patterns, but also knowing like how, how to differentiate like with the different patterns. And so part of the talk was me like wanting to start this like global pattern initiative, like cultural patterns of understanding, um, you know, like what type of patterns would be more favorable for like East Asian languages, or right to left languages. So, for example, like Neff mentioned, like in Japan, people want to know as much information as possible up front. So their websites are very text heavy, which in Western design, we're taught like, lots of white space, simple, progressive disclosure. And that just doesn't go well in Japan. So, understanding to create patterns for that, and seeing like how, your product reflects those patterns.
Yeah, there's something interesting about that. And I know we've been talking about sort of like components versus patterns this entire episode. And I think one of the things that is sort of illuminating for me is that in lots of ways, components are sort of agnostic. Like a button is a button, right? Like push the button to do the thing that you want the button to do, hopefully. But it seems like patterns are. Uh, they have an opinion, right? Like it is like we know what users are trying to do and we think that this is the best way to be able to get them from point A to point B. And in doing that, it almost seems like before you can effectively document a pattern, you probably have to engage in some level of user research or have like some sort of data that you are reliant on in order to make sure that your interpretation of this pattern is actually going to help the user solve that problem effectively. Is that fair enough, or is it possible to document patterns without sort of like a robust understanding of who you're designing for?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So, I think especially with like centralized design system teams, so that's a team that is creating all the components and pushing them out to other teams to consume. Um, they're not getting that product context necessarily as deeply as people who are designing in the product. So, um, it's really helpful. Patterns are probably best established like at the product level. So you might not even be on
Mm,
the design system team or part of the design system team, but you're designing screens and workflows, and you know, you can definitely take those and contribute to a design system. And so the design system is really there to like help share information and align different teams so they're not having to do the research for like every type of culture, every type of user for a
mhm,
dashboard. So it kind of scales a little bit better than having those specific every team going to kind of do the user research for everything. Because I think the other thing is like a lot of teams don't have the user research capacity that they wish they did. So it's a little bit of like working smarter to kind of, hone in on some user research insights to create those patterns and then share them with a broader team so they don't have to do the user research as well. Um, but I think, depending on the type of pattern, so I guess it depends. So, like some patterns, like a empty state, probably can be um, universally designed. So you
sure.
might not need to do the user research, but if you're doing something like super complicated, um, you know, so like say like a medical X-ray product app or something, you might need to know the context of the doctors and the medical staff using the app, and then understand the context of what it's like to use this in North America versus like you know Asia Pacific area versus Africa versus like Europe, because it could be very different, probably because the medical systems are very different, but that's a different conversation for a different podcast.
Exactly. I was gonna say that that is not only a different episode of a podcast, that probably is like seasons and seasons of a very different podcast. Um, okay, so I think I'm grasping it sort of, right? Like you have these components that you've created, you have user research, you understand what your users are trying to do. And based off of that, you sort of like define these patterns that are inherently flexible and might change a little bit based off of user context or the product that you place them in, and all sorts of things. So if you get to the point that your patterns are documented, then how do you enforce patterns? And I think that this is a really interesting question because, to your earlier point, there is some degree of flexibility. So, since there's flexibility, it seems hard to be like, hey, you implemented that pattern wrong. Because the designer probably is like, but no, I was using my like flexibility and was trying to do what I thought was right for the user. So what do those conversations look like? Maybe you've had a conversation with a designer in the past where you can kind of draw on that to tell us how we enforce patterns.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's the thing is like, it's definitely a delicate balance, but it's something that I think teams can achieve. So part of that is, going back to like the definition of a pattern, like, what does a pattern mean at your organization? Um, and understanding like what are the prescriptive elements and ensuring that at the very least that the prescriptive elements are there. So if they're
Mm,
not there, saying like they're using a different font or the different size font, like that's definitely something that can be identified as something that needs to get fixed. Like the you know details of the pattern, I think as long as it follows like the general flow. So okay, if it's a login pattern, they had to add like a different screen because of some other odd type of authentication. Um, as long as it fits the general flow, I think, you know, that is something that's negotiable, right? So like having that conversation to understand like what was the purpose of this, and the why and the how can open up to a lot of understanding. So that might mean that this is okay. It might mean that this is something that you add to the pattern library, like as part of the pattern of like, hey, in these use cases, you can add this extra screen, and see this product where this is happening. Um, so it's a matter of like nobody wants to be like the design system police because nobody likes the police. another another topic for a different podcast. But I think the idea is that you know this is a two-way conversation. Um, understanding the why and the how, and feeding that back into your design system as potential update to the pattern. Um,
yeah, yeah. I guess to try to go forward with that analogy, maybe you're like the design system firefighters. Firefighters are usually unproblematic. And you're like, okay, like you have to use this particular material to design the house because you don't want it to burn down. And you should have this amount of structural integrity so that people don't fall through the floor. And I think perhaps the same is true of the different things that you're doing in terms of patterns, right? It's like, hey, like this topography is important, these colors are important, etc. And like those are sort of the non-negotiables. But like what the house looks like to a certain extent, and like the paint color that you use, well, that's a bad example. Use the right colors. Stay with the brand. But hopefully you guys see where I'm going here. That there are certainly things that are like, no, like that's integral to the structure of the house, and like some things that are sort of like up to your interpretation to make it look a little bit better, to make sure that it is serving who it needs to a little bit. It's a really good shout there that there are things that are important and some things that are a little bit more flexible.
yeah, I like that analogy of like firefighters and just understanding, yeah, the level of flexibility that you do have. Like there are some, there are going to be some reasons why you need to have certain things. And that's totally fair game. I think the other thing is like to help prevent people from going like, I don't know, crazy with like their patterns and like implementation or their interpretation of the pattern is to show examples of,
Mm,
screens in the product that use the pattern. So even though they might look different, or behave differently in certain ways, people can get a gist of like, oh, I know how I'm supposed to use like this dashboard pattern or this login pattern. So I think sometimes that's the other thing is like the guidelines can be really helpful, but it can be hard to understand like something abstract and apply it to something more specific.
For sure, for sure. And I guess like so I think that's perfect, right? Like you document the patterns, you have examples of the patterns in maybe the design system site or other places where people might be able to see, okay, that person took the pattern and made something like really beautiful with it. But I think the other place where people might be able to find some inspiration, especially if you're just getting started documenting patterns, is to look at examples of really good patterns in other design systems out there in the world. Are there any that consistently show up for you as great examples of patterns?
Yeah. So I think that's the thing is like it's kind of hard to find uh design systems with a lot of patterns. Even maybe with like, you know, yeah, I think just in general, because you'll go to a design system site and they'll have like a pattern section and then you'll see like one or something like that. So um the ones that I like are IBM's Carbon Design. Like if you check out their empty state and like Lightning Salesforce's Lightning design system. It's under design guidelines, so you can see an example of their empty state to kind of see like how people are documenting them. Gov.uk has a lot of great patterns. NewsKit's design system has some patterns as well. I think what's kind of cool about Gov.uk's patterns is that they have the date on them. And so, like, they're several years old, which doesn't mean that
Hmm.
they're out of date. It just means that those patterns have lasted this long, like, without having to change. So, I think that's the other thing is like, you know, you're aiming for some semblance of longevity of this, and I think you can definitely do that because, um, it's not so it might not be as prescriptive, like, there's a lot of flexibility, like, you're gonna still have the same elements of an empty state, um, you know, now versus, like, 5 years from now. Um, like, the UI might have changed in terms of, like, colors and, like, some of those other prescriptive elements, but for the most part, the layout's the same, so that pattern is, legit even though it's older. Doesn't I feel like in society today, if like a blog post isn't from like this year or last year, it's like old news. But that's definitely not the case with like um patterns for sure.
Yeah, it almost would seem to me that if you had a pattern and it only lasted like a few months and you felt the need to update it, that would be the hallmark of like a pretty bad pattern. Because like as long as users are attempting to solve the same problem and it's like leading to what it's supposed to, then theoretically like that pattern should be good for like years and years and years. So certainly makes sense. It is cool to know that when you've invested all of the work associated with documenting and creating patterns that work is going to last for a while. So like you're good to go for a minute versus it being something that is ongoing work that takes quite a bit of time.
Yeah, and I think even if your pattern did change in a couple of months, like it just means that you're probably still figuring some stuff out.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think that's the other thing is like, it might not be create a pattern and within a couple weeks and then make everyone use it. Like maybe test the waters with like one product and see, how well that pattern works. Um, and then, if it does well, you can fold it into the design system. I think that's kind of like, where it goes back to like relying on the teams that make the actual products to see like
Mm.
what patterns are emerging from some of their products and if there's opportunities to align.
Yeah, yeah, that's a sensible approach as well too, right? Like especially if you are talking about these big multi-product design systems or if you're working with multiple brands and there's going to be a pattern shared across many of them, it certainly makes sense to start relatively small, try it out in a couple products, make sure that it's leading to the effect that you want, and then it's like, oh, okay, this is a great pattern. Like let's use it across multiple different places. I think that's a really, really good shout, and probably a much more responsible way of dealing with patterns versus my quick and dirty approach. Like, I got it, throw it everywhere. Um, that's why you're here to give us some wisdom.
So old knowledge, I guess. Years of experience and battle scars, I don't know. Um,
Fair enough. Um, So we got a question over here from Aaliyah that I think is a good one. Aaliyah says, "I would think that consumer behavior changes affects the pattern's longevity, trends, or staying standard." In quotation marks.
Yeah, I mean, I will say it depends. But, it I guess it's, like, depends on, like, what your product is, and that's true, like, consumer behavior is gonna change, um, behaviors are gonna change in products, especially if, like, say, like, TikTok introduces a new feature for logging in that makes it super easy to log in, like, maybe that's what other companies start to follow. I think if it makes sense for your product to go in that direction, um, then it's definitely worth trying. I think the other thing is like, you know, it's like the things usually take a long time to get from design or concept into a product, and then, maybe especially if you have like a if you're at like a large company that has several products, it might not all work its way, magically into all their products, like, quickly. It could take, a while, like 3 months, 6 months, 9 months before everyone's starting to use that. So, maybe one product is a little bit more nimble that can kind of align with trends, a little bit quicker. Um, and maybe that they can kind of be like the flagship app that other apps, at your company follow. But also, if your app is something that needs to stay on top of trends, you're probably going to, you know, change out your patterns more frequently. But I think there are going to be some, like, I think it's understanding like which ones will have a shorter longevity versus which ones will like have a longer lifespan. Um, so, like a shopping cart flow probably has a longer lifespan, but how you create content on TikTok with like the tools that you use probably have a shorter lifespan.
Mm,
Um, and that might be helpful in terms of like as a design system team or a design team trying to understand, instead of like being adamant about, no, this pattern needs to stay the same for years. It could be like, this is one of the short-lived patterns. So it's
mm.
okay that we change it. Or no, this is a long lifespan pattern. But also probably depends on implementation too. Like, can you easily change some of your TikTok tools, for your pattern? But is it harder to switch any, like, types of, like, purchasing options that you might have, or purchasing flows because a lot of infrastructure on the back end would need to be changed. So, definitely, like, lots of things to consider, and it's also a really great opportunity to speak with other designers, and engineers at the company to see kind of, like, what has to happen to make some of these shifts, because that can definitely point you in a direction that maybe you wanted or didn't want.
All right. Before I read this next question, I have to preface it by saying that we did not pay Ingrid to ask this question. This is completely off the cuff. But Ingrid asks, apart from Figma, Notion, or legacy tools, which tool would you advocate to document a design system? Michelle, I'll let you go first.
I think I would have to go with, zero height.
I can't imagine why.
Do you have a suggestion, a recommendation?
I do. I have a zero height recommendation as well. But if I were to be slightly less facetious, and curious, Michelle, if you wanted to talk not necessarily just about the tool that you would recommend, but sort of like how you would go about recommending that tool. But the things that I would say are, what are the tools that are a part of your like design system ecosystem right now? So if you're using Figma on the design side, then I would pick a design system management tool that also integrates with Figma in a way that is going to be good for you all. If you're using Storybook or GitHub or GitLab or any of those things, then again, you're also looking for a design system management tool that is going to integrate with some of the tools that you all are using on the development side of things. I think beyond that, one of the other questions that I would be asking myself is, who is going to contribute to this design system, and how do we make it as easy as possible for these folks to be able to create and maintain it? So that might mean that it is relatively easy to use if you know that there are going to be non-technical members of your team who are going to contribute. contribute. Or maybe it's going to be the devs that are going to lead it, and how hard or easy the tool is to use is maybe a non-factor. So those sort of things like depend a little bit. And I think if I were to take a step back from being like obviously a large proponent of zero height, then I think the answer is probably it depends. I do think for lots and lots of teams, zero height is going to check all of those boxes. But I would be remiss in saying that like it does depend, and you've got to decide what is going to be right for the people who are going to contribute to your design system, and then also the people who are going to consume it. But Michelle, what do you think?
Yeah, like totally. I think that's the thing is like, you can definitely document your design system in Figma or Notion or even Google Docs. Like I think it's I think those are good short-term options, but if
Mm-hmm.
you're looking to establish a design system and, I there's an article I wrote about, stop calling your design system a product. It's really infrastructure to get the proper resourcing for it and the proper usage. Like you'll have to eventually move to a design system documentation tool. Um, I think for the time being, sure, Figma might be a great option. Um, or Notion, but you'll outgrow that. Um,
Sure.
and so, maybe that's what you're I think that's the other thing is like teams and like I was part of this like where I was like, I really want at my last company, I was like, I really want zero height, but like we didn't have the budget for it in terms of like the way the
Mm.
planning cycle went. So like I couldn't just not document our design system. So we just, put stuff in Confluence for the time being. And then when
Oh
the
no,
budget
I'm just
yeah.
kidding.
Well, I think that's the thing. So, like, when the budget cycle rolled around like, I think that's the thing. Because of the level of effort that you had to use the tool, like, Confluence is great for some things, but not for design system documentation. Like, we kind of shortcutted a lot of things, which wasn't great until we can get the money, in our budget to do that. So I think that's what ends up happening quite a bit is that, like, designers will definitely want something like a zero height or knapsack or supernova. But then when it comes to budget, like, things just the timing doesn't really work. So you have to do something in the interim. Um, but I think the other thing is like there's a lot of friction with tools that aren't built to support design systems. And I think
Hmm.
that's super frustrating is that when your team is frustrated because they have to do so many steps to document, they're not going to want to document. And, if something were to change, that is also going to cause a lot of friction because then you have to like export the images, find them on your computer, upload them, all this other stuff, and it's not nimble. Which is why when I was at my last company looking at Zero Height, because I'm like, oh, this makes things so easy. We don't have to do too much. So like finding solutions that remove a lot of the friction is what I would definitely recommend. So like kind of like what Neff was saying, like making sure something works within the tools that you already use but taking out a lot of that friction and pain points from um, people's workflows. So I know that sometimes some people build a self-built like code from scratch design system site. And then when we've done the how we document survey, we'll get a lot of feedback saying like one of the frustrating things is that designers can't update the site frequently because they have to like then ask a developer who then has to make the change and then do a pull request and all this other stuff. So, keep stuff in mind like what the friction points are and how can you alleviate them. Um, because maybe, it can work if you are only in Figma or only in Notion or using a combination of things. Um, but I think in the like longer term, at some point you'll need a design system documentation tool.
Yeah, I think that was super eloquently said. We got another question that kind of brings us back to patterns a little bit. And to be fair, like you probably aren't documenting patterns very well if you haven't figured out where to document them. Um, but the question is, so you've done all the work to document these patterns. Now, how do you get teams to use them and then advocate for them? What do you think, Michelle?
Yeah, a lot of that's just getting some visibility. So having a good like communication system for your design system um in terms of, when there is like something new added, so maybe you add a new pattern, does that mean that you communicate this information over Slack or Teams? Do you have a newsletter? Do you have like monthly team meetings? Do you have like design critiques that people sit in on? So I know some teams will have like design system team members sit in on the different design system or design critiques to say, hey, we have a component for that. Just making an announcement. I think the other thing is just um, letting like repeating yourself quite a bit, right? Like just saying, "Hey, don't forget there is this pattern." If you're in design critique and someone's using something that is similar to an existing pattern, you say, "Hey, you know what? You might be able to use this other pattern." Um, I think that's a really great way to just, advocate for them. I think the other thing is like, and this kind of goes with design system adoption, is like finding champions. So if you have a lead designer that is really excited about the design system, they can also highlight, hey, I'm using this pattern, or hey, don't forget to use this pattern. And sometimes that when someone isn't on the design system team that is advocating for the design system team, that has a tendency to resonate a little bit more strongly of like, oh, a third party person is advocating for this. This might make more sense versus like some people are like, oh yeah, it's just the design system team just pushing components and patterns on us. So I think that might also resonate well, but really sharing and encouraging, but also, reciprocating in terms of if you're sitting in the design critiques, if you see, something coming up in different ones, you can say, hey, this might be a good candidate for a pattern that we can include in our design system. Um, and I think that also helps build, trust within the organization too, of like, oh, I'm being heard. I can contribute to patterns, and they are taking, some of my design work into something that can scale, which I think would be really rewarding for the designer who created that perspective pattern.
Yeah, it's interesting that this is a question because I feel like adoption is so intertwined in everything that you do in design systems. Like a few episodes ago, we talked about adoption kind of in its own thing, but the reality of it is like let's say that you have an established design system and you've gotten people to adopt components. That is like part of it, right? And now you're like, okay, I'm going to start documenting patterns. You almost have to not necessarily start at square one, but you start your work again trying to evangelize the design system as a whole, but also trying to evangelize this new avenue that you're in and saying, like, hey guys, now we have patterns. Isn't that so great? Why don't you want to use them? So it sort of is that like adoption is intertwined in every single thing that you do. And even if you document like the best pattern in the entirety of the world, it kind of doesn't matter if people like don't find it, they don't utilize it. So the minute that you're done doing something as a design system practitioner, you immediately turn into sort of like a cheerleader for what you've done.
Yeah, and I think, you can build off of that momentum of like now that people have adopted components, it's like,
Hmm.
hey, we are leveling things up. We're working on patterns, and you know, having like an open call of like, hey, if you have a suggestion for a pattern, or if you notice something that's repeatable that could do really well in our other products, like give us a shout, right? Like kind of open that line of communication, but also just like, having like a nice space to have some of the hard work figured out. So like, I mean, if I had to design a dashboard, I wouldn't want to start from scratch. Like if there is something out there that I could like a pattern that I can reference to see like, okay, this is how I should be thinking about dashboards and this is what I probably want to include. That's going to take a lot of the cognitive load off of me, and I would actually be happier to have some guidance to go with. So really just trying to show, hey, like we're trying to make some of the more complex stuff a lot easier for you. Um, would be super awesome, because nobody wants to have to think about, okay, how do I need to space this? What was
Hmm.
important? What do I need to do? What are all the things that I have to think about? People just want to, get the design done and make sure that it's serving the users without having to kind of understand all those nuances.
For sure, for sure. And I think that's like kind of the perfect place to end this episode because we went from like, how do you even start documenting patterns to like, okay, now you've got the pattern documented. How do you get people to actually use it? So thank you. Totally unplanned question that left us at a great spot. So I think that's it for now. Unless, Michelle, do you have any last thoughts for our pattern documenters out there?
Yeah, I think, just start small. and see where it goes. Like, I wouldn't stress out too much. I feel like this is like an evolving space. Like, now that a lot of people have gotten like a good understanding of components and variants and working different tools, that like the next level is patterns. Um, happy to have additional conversations in our Slack channel Zeros, which is
Hmm.
free to join. Um, and I think feel free to like let us know and share with others your experience, because the more that we can share, the better it will be for everyone else trying to like navigate this. So it'd be really good for the design system community. But yeah, thank you so much for joining.
Yes, we hope to see you and continue the conversation over on Slack. And next month, we have another episode coming where we are going to talk about how user research fits into design systems. And I'm particularly excited about that one because we kind of alluded to some of the ways in which folks might be able to use user research in this episode. But there obviously is a whole lot more. So, really hoping to see y'all next week, either on the live podcast recording or on wherever you are listening to this particular podcast. Thanks again for joining, and we'll see you soon.